Hello and welcome to the March Crane Research Forum. Thank you so much for being here today. We're glad you're here. My name is Dr. Rebecca Dorr, and I'm a Senior Research Associate here at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. My colleague Kathy is going to be monitoring our chat box today, and we'll be adding our housekeeping items there. These monthly forums feature research on emerging or key topics that impact the field of early child care and education. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Lauren Jones to speak with us. Dr. Lauren Jones is an OSU Associate Professor in the Department of Human Sciences and the John Glenn College of Public Affairs and a Faculty Associate here at the Crane Center. Before arriving at Ohio State, Dr. Jones completed a postdoc at the University of Toronto and earned her PhD from the Department of Policy Analysis and Management at Cornell University. Dr. Jones conducts quantitative policy-based research on child and family well-being, especially in the areas of consumer protection, social policy, and health. Broadly, her interests lie in understanding factors that affect the ability of children and families to flourish and how government policy can help families get ahead. Dr. Jones has been published in top journals and covered by major media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg News, the Freakonomics podcast, and the New York Times. Dr. Jones is here with us today to speak on tax policies and child development. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Jones.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I'm very excited to be here to talk about tax policy and child development. Over the weekend, I was at a party and mentioned to someone that I was doing this talk on tax policy. And I got the response that I often get when I say I'm talking about tax policy, which was a big eye roll. And, well, that sounds interesting kind of reaction. So I'm sure there's some of you on the call as well that kind of hear the words tax policy and start going to sleep. But I hope that by the end of the talk, I will have convinced you that it's more than a boring topic. In fact, it's something that affects all of our lives and that we really need to be aware of. So, I think tax policy, especially recently, has been in the news a ton. Here are just a few headlines that I pulled from recent articles, really reflecting the fact that tax policy is everywhere and that it impacts all aspects of our lives, including child development. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So just to give you a quick kind of overview of where we're going in the talk, I'm going to start by defining what tax policy is and what I mean by when I talk about tax policy. And then I'm going to give you just kind of a broad theoretical connection of why we think that tax policy might affect child development outcomes. And then for the rest of the talk, I'm going to hone in on kind of a little corner of tax policy and talk in particular about child tax credits. So let's start by defining tax policy. So you can think of tax policy as being the particular mix of tools that governments use to raise revenue. And of course, raising revenue is the primary purpose of taxation. That's how governments make money in order to kind of facilitate their spending. But in addition to revenue raising, there are kind of two other motivating factors that can determine the particular set of tax tools that a government uses. The first is redistribution. So, depending on how we structure our tax policy, that can lead either to more or less redistribution, that is moving resources from those who have lots to those who have less. And then the second motivating factor that can really determine the particular blend of tools that a government can use is the idea of encouraging or discouraging certain economic behaviors. So when you impose a tax on something that increases the price of that good, the effective price of that good, and in kind of an economic theory way of looking at the world, when you make something cost more, people are less likely to consume it. And so, governments can really have these ideas in mind when they're determining what mix of tools they want to use. So what are the tools that governments have on hand to choose from when they're establishing their particular tax policy? Well, we can think of there being kind of three broad classes of taxes. The first is taxes on wealth. So tax on wealth is a tax on some valuable asset that an individual or business is holding. So the tax is going to be levied regardless of whether the asset changes hands. So in the United States, the biggest wealth tax that we have is the property tax. But there's been increasing discussions of levying additional wealth taxes on other valuable assets like stock holdings and things like that. But for the time being, the only one we have is property tax here. There's also taxes on consumption. So the sales tax is going to be an example of that. And then finally, we have taxes on work and earnings. So that's going to include your individual income tax, capital gains tax that you would pay on any earnings you make from selling a valuable asset, and then the corporate income tax would all be examples of those types of taxes. So in addition to the things that governments choose to tax, there's also another important consideration is what governments choose not to tax. So governments can use exemptions, subsidies, or tax credits as a way to essentially encourage consumption of certain items. And so we're going to talk a lot today about tax credits in particular. But before we get into that, I wanted to just give you a kind of just very broad idea of why it is that we think tax policy might affect child development. So when you levy a tax on something, essentially what you're doing is changing the relative price of that good relative to other goods. So if we take a very simple example, imagine a government chooses to put a tax on peanut butter. Well, when you change the relative prices of goods, you really expect people to have some kind of behavioral response, whether that's families, businesses, or institutions. So in our peanut butter tax example, if a government taxes peanut butter, we can expect families to respond by changing their consumption of their behavior around consumption of nut butter. So maybe switching to an almond butter, for example, or another substitute, because peanut butter has become relatively more expensive than the available substitute. The behavioral response is what is going to lead really to that child development outcome, that change in a child development outcome. So in the peanut butter example, maybe we're going to wind up with more peanut allergies because kids are being exposed to peanuts less as small children. So in this kind of very simplified example, we've got the government up here imposing the tax on peanut butter, and we've got the child development outcome down here, which is essentially being mediated by this behavioral response of the family in response to the new tax. So that gives you kind of a broad sense of why it might be that tax policies could potentially affect child development outcomes. So I'm going to move now into talking about a particular corner of tax policy. So whereas tax policy includes all that kind of broad array of wealth taxes, sales taxes, consumption taxes, et cetera, I'm going to now hone in on a very kind of small corner of individual income tax policy in particular. So individual income tax policy is going to be the mix of tools that the government uses to tax the resources of the household. So, when you pay your income taxes to the state or to the federal government, you're essentially being subjected to the income tax policies of those jurisdictions. And then if we kind of look even further and dig in a little more, another small corner of the overall individual income tax policy is going to be tax credits. So I want to start by talking about, what exactly is a tax credit? And then again, I want to talk through, what is the behavioral connection between tax credits and child development outcomes? And then I'm going to finish up by going through some of the research demonstrating that these tax credits do affect child development outcomes. And I'll focus on some of the studies that I worked on in particular. So let's talk about child tax credits. So what's a tax credit? A tax credit is exactly what it sounds like. It's a credit against any tax owed. A tax credit can be partially or fully refundable. When a tax credit is refundable, what that means is that even if you don't owe taxes, you're still going to be credited with the value of the credit. So if you're a family that doesn't owe any taxes and you are eligible to receive a credit, you're going to get that money back in your pocket, and the tax credit is going to effectively act as a cash transfer. We can contrast this with non-refundable tax credits, where a family can only benefit from the value of the tax credit if they owe taxes. So once their tax liability is reduced to zero, they're not going to get any more tax credit. They're not going to get the money back in their pocket. So child tax credits in particular are used extensively in many countries. You can see here, we've got, for example, just in the United States, Canada, and the UK, kind of a series of tax credits that all operate in similar ways. So these are, for the most part, refundable tax credits that are targeted at families, and they're essentially operating as income transfers to families with kids. Child tax credits and tax credits in general can be what we call means-tested, universal, or work-based, and I'll talk a little bit more about what those exactly mean as we go forward here. So before we get into the research, I wanted to just kind of make some connections here to help us think through why it is that these child tax credits might impact child development outcomes down the road. So the behavioral mechanisms that we're considering can be summed up really with this, that money is good for kids. A lot of evidence to demonstrate that this is the case. I want to take a quick aside here to talk about a paper that I'm working on right now, essentially demonstrating the fact that money is good for child development outcomes. This is a bit of an aside, but I'm really excited about this work, so I wanted to find a way to sneak it into the talk. So this is a paper where my co-authors and I are trying to estimate and evaluate what's the effect of recessions on child mental health outcomes. So we're interested in what happens to child mental health when a family goes through a recession and loses income. And we have access to a really cool data set that's helping us answer this question. So we've got administrative data on all children who were enrolled in public schools in the province of British Columbia between 2000 and 2017. And so that's about 400,000 children. And we have annual data on a variety of outcomes for those kids, including any in-school mental health diagnoses that the kids may have. The really cool thing about this data set is that we've managed to link the data to their parents' tax records. So we also know a lot about what's going on from an income standpoint in the households of these kids. So what we do is we compare kids whose families did and did not lose income during the 2007 financial crisis. And because we've got such a rich data set, we're able to control for a whole variety of factors, including what we call individual fixed effects, which is kind of a fancy statistical term of saying that we're able to kind of control for the fact that there's probably pre-existing differences in the kids whose families did and did not lose income during the crisis. So let me show you the results of, or the preliminary results of the study, of this study, which is still a working paper. So what I've plotted out here in this graph is the rate of mental health diagnoses among kids whose families lost income during the financial crisis. What you can see in the years leading up to the financial crisis, we've got essentially kind of no difference between mental health diagnoses rates among the families that will eventually lose income in the financial crisis and those that don't. As soon as the financial crisis hits, though, you can see this big jump up of almost 1 percentage point in the rate of these child mental health diagnoses. In total, we estimate that there's about a 20% increase in new diagnoses among kids who live in households that lost income during the recession. We also find evidence that the effect is larger for boys than girls and larger for Indigenous kids than non-Indigenous kids. So, this is a bit of an aside just to kind of give you a sense of the fact that, money is a really important input to child development, that when families are losing money, we see kids suffering and kids kind of having these increased incidences of mental health. And the opposite is true as well. And I'll show you more evidence as we go through that, if you give money to families, we see improvements in these types of outcomes. So, that's the kind of overall effect. But if we're thinking about mechanisms, what are some of the channels that can lead from a cash infusion to the family to mental health or to improved child outcomes for the kids living in that family? So I've broken down the effect into these different channels. This is like a nice way for us to kind of think through how does that connection actually work. So on the one hand, if we give cash to a family, we can think about there being a change in what the family is able to purchase. So giving cash to the family allows the family to purchase things that are important for child development, like books, healthy food, that kind of thing. We can call this the resource channel. It's also true that if you give families cash, that can lead to improved household dynamics, maybe because there's reduced financial stress in the household, for example. We're going to call that the family process channel. And then finally, we can think about the cash infusion, if we give family a cash transfer, as that affecting decisions about how much to work. Now, this labor supply channel isn't quite as cut and dry as the resource and family process channel. Firstly, if you give families cash, we can't predict if they're going to work more or work less necessarily. On the one hand, if you give families cash, maybe they're able to buy a car or pay for childcare, things that facilitate the parents joining the labor force if they want to do that. But on the other hand, if you give families cash, that can mean that there's more financial slack in the budget, and it can kind of free up one of the family members to reduce their labor supply, maybe move to part-time work or even drop out of the labor force to spend more time with the kids. Similarly, depending on what the family circumstances is, labor force participation and parents working can be a good or a bad thing for child development. So this kind of third channel here is a little less clear than the first two, but the kind of sum of it all is that what we think is that when we give families money, they are going to use the money in order to kind of facilitate these three channels, these three behavioral responses, which can then in turn improve child development outcomes. So let's get into some of the research on child tax credits. So as I mentioned, child tax credits can be either means tested, universal, or work-based. And I'm going to talk about the research in that way. So I'll start by discussing means tested child tax credit. So a means tested tax credit is one that is most generous for families with the lowest earnings or families who have zero earnings, and then phase out, become less generous as family income increases. So down here, I've got what we call a tax schedule. So this shows us that how much tax credit the family is going to get based on the family's income. So along the bottom axis here, you can see the household income. Along the y-axis here, you can see the value of the credit. And so what this is showing you is that for this particular tax credit, families who have zero earnings are getting a really generous tax credit of about $7,000 a year. And as family earnings increase, the tax credit is going to phase out. So what I'm showing you here is the credit schedule for what we call the Canada Child Benefit. So this is a means tested child tax credit that's existed in Canada since 2016. And I'm going to talk about this child tax credit and some of the research on it. But the reason I'm kind of so interested, or I'm interested in this tax credit for its own merit, but it's particularly interesting right now because this other picture I'm showing you here shows the new and improved tax schedule for the child tax credit here in the United States that was just expanded for this most recent tax year. So these blue lines show us the tax schedule for the child tax credit in 2021. You can see that it looks very similar to the tax credit that exists in Canada. You can contrast this with what we had prior to this expansion, this light gray line here. So you can see that on the one hand, it was much less generous. It was only about $2,000 a year. And most relevantly, for the poorest families, the tax credit was actually smaller. It was not the most generous for the poorest families. The reason for that is that this credit was not fully refundable prior to this new American Rescue Plan change to this policy. So because of the fact that it was not refundable, what that meant was that families that didn't owe tax essentially did not get the value of the tax credit, which is why it appears smaller for these lower income families. So, this change, this expansion to the child tax credit here in the United States makes things look a lot more similar to what we've got going on in Canada right now. And because of that, I'm going to show you some of the evidence on how the Canada Child Benefit has affected child development outcomes. So we can kind of use that information to potentially predict how the expanded child tax credit in the US could affect child development outcomes as we go forward. So the studies that I'm going to talk about in this portion of the talk all kind of use similar research methods. So we're interested in all these studies and trying to identify what's the causal effect of giving families this money. Now, many of you may know that if we want to identify the causal effect of something, the gold standard in terms of research and doing that is running a randomized control trial. So running a randomized control trial, what we would do is we would randomly select some families, give some of them the treated families the money, and then keep a set of control families that we gave nothing to. So in the context of tax credits, this is almost an impossible experiment to run, both because it would be kind of prohibitively expensive, also because it would be potentially unethical depending on how we structured it. So because we can't do the gold standard, we can't do the RCT, what researchers do is essentially look for what we call natural experiments. We use policy-induced changes in the generosity of the tax credit to kind of mimic that random assignment of money. So in this case, we're using changes at the province at the province level to how generous the tax credits are, and comparing the outcomes of kids who live in places where the credit became more generous to kids in places where they kept a less generous credit. So that's the approach that this paper used, using data similar to the NLSY here in the United States. What the researchers found was that $1,000 increase in tax credit income led to about a 0.7% of a standard deviation improvement in math scores. It led to about a 15% of a standard deviation reduction in physical aggression scores among girls, and a 5% of a standard deviation improvement in physical health scores for boys. So to put this in context, for example, the math score in Canada, the rich poor test gap score is about 60% of a standard deviation. So in this context, the $1,000 narrowed that rich poor test gap by about 10%. The researchers also found some kind of differential effects for boys and girls, depending on the outcome they were looking at. And then most importantly, they found that the effect of the tax credit income was most effective for kids from the poorest families. The researchers in this study also looked at some mechanisms. So they found evidence of the family process channel. So remember, that's the channel where the cash infusion essentially improves family dynamics, potentially by reducing financial stress in the household. So they found that $1,000 in tax credit income led to about a 20% of a standard deviation reduction in maternal depression. And then in a second study that I worked on recently, we found evidence of the resource channel as well. So using a similar research design to the last study that I was just discussing, we wanted to find out how are families spending the money they use. And so we used survey data on spending among Canadian families. And what we found was that if you give a family $1 of tax credit income, they spend about 46 cents of it. And they tend to spend the money on things that we know are important inputs to child development, like childcare, food at stores, transportation, and even recreation. In this study, we also found some evidence of the family process channel. We found that when you give families $1 in tax credit income, they actually reduce their spending on some goods. Most importantly, they reduce their spending on tobacco and alcohol, which again kind of suggests to us that the money that families are receiving in tax credits could be reducing stress in the household. And that's how we're kind of getting to those child development, those outcomes that or those child development improvements that I just demonstrated, those increases in math scores, et cetera. So, if we're kind of thinking about this in the US context, we can use the findings from the Canadian context to predict how families and kids may respond to this newly expanded child tax credit here in the US. Okay, the next type of tax credit that I want to talk about is what we call universal tax credit. So universal tax credits, unlike the means tested credit, is the same amount for every family. So, here is our tax credit schedule. You can see that this credit, it's the same amount regardless of how much families earn. I could have continued this access on out to $1 million. Every family was receiving $1,700 a month. So this is the tax credit schedule of what we call the universal child care benefit. This was another credit that existed in Canada up till 2015. And universal tax credits are actually pretty rare. This would look a lot like what you would think of as a universal basic income. So if you've heard people talk about that, that's what this would look like. It's the same amount of credit regardless of how much income the family earns. So because we've only got really one example of this type of credit in the Western world, I'm going to talk about some of the evidence on how this universal childcare benefit in Canada affected child development outcomes. So in a recent study that I worked at, we used that same British Columbia public school data that I mentioned earlier to compare test score results for kids that did and did not receive this universal child care benefit when they were small. So what we did, we compared kids who were born before the credit was implemented to kids who were born after the credit was implemented. So kids who received the credit because they were born late enough. So this graph kind of shows the main results of the study. For kids born, along the bottom here, I've got the birth year of the child. And then this shows us the marginal effect on the grade 4 reading test score, a standardized test score for children. So what you can see is that for kids born in 1998, 1999, and 2000 who didn't receive any child tax credit, there's kind of very small or no effects. For kids born later, we see this kind of improvement in their grade 4 reading test score, depending on how many years of tax credit they received. In sum, what we found was that 5 years of receiving the UCCB, this universal child care benefit for 5 years, closed the high-low income test gap by around 35% for these different tests. So that's a huge effect. Just to kind of be clear, 5 years of receiving this UCCB would be equivalent of receiving around $8,000 in the first 5 years of life for families. We also found that this effect was really concentrated among the poorest families. Another researcher found evidence that the UCCB may be improving child development outcomes through the labor supply channel. So Cheryl found that implementing this universal child tax credit caused mothers, married mothers in particular, to reduce their working hours, suggesting that mothers may have been able to spend more time with kids, and that could be a potential mechanism for improving the test scores. The last set of papers I want to talk about are the research on what we call work-based child tax credits. So work-based child tax credits are exactly what they sound like. They're tax credits that you can get only if you are working. The biggest and best example of a work-based tax credit is the earned income tax credit here in the United States. So here's our tax schedule and our benefit schedule for the EITC, as it's often called. So again, we've got the family's earnings along the bottom here. You can see we've got the credit amount here. And this looks a lot different than the previous two types of credits we were looking at. For the EITC, you can see that for the lowest earning families, they're receiving the smallest credit. In fact, families that aren't working don't receive any credit. As families increase their labor force, work more and more, the credit becomes larger. So the work-based tax credit, and the earned income tax credit in particular, has what we call a labor subsidy. For the lowest earnings, the credit grows with the more you work. Then we get to kind of this phase out threshold here, and the credit starts looking more like one of those means tested credits from earlier, where the value of the credit phases out as earnings increase. But the big kind of relevant part of these types of credits is this work subsidy portion of the tax schedule, where the government's actually giving you a larger and larger credit based on how much you work or how much you earn. The idea being that this is going to incentivize people to work more or to join the labor force. So what does the research say on the EITC and child outcomes? Well, there's a huge literature on the EITC on various household outcomes. And child development outcomes are included in those. So I'm going to just show you results from a few studies that use similar kind of natural experiment methods as I was describing before in various types of data sets. So these authors found good evidence that $1,000 of EITC income does improve child development outcomes. For example, if you give families $1,000 of EITC income, researchers have estimated that increases math and reading scores by about 6% of a standard deviation. So to put that estimate in context, the high-low income gap, test score income gap, is about 1 standard deviation. So, this money is not making a huge dent. We've got only a 6% reduction of that gap, but it's still having an important effect. This graph kind of shows the same result. You can see that families who get a more generous credit, or kids whose families get more generous credits, are also doing better, scoring better on these standardized test scores. In terms of the mechanisms, how is the EITC creating these child development improvements? Well, there's evidence of all three channels at play. The resource channel, researchers have demonstrated that families spend their EITC on food, housing, and used cars, which can help families get to work, or even transport kids to developmentally stimulating activities. There's also lots of evidence that the EITC income could be operating through the family process channel. So in particular, I worked on a couple studies where we were interested in understanding how the EITC affect household finances. So what we did was we capitalized on the fact that the EITC income is kind of unique in terms of tax credits, in that it's paid out in one lump sum at tax time. So families who are eligible for the largest tax credit, or the most generous tax credits, about $6,000 a year, they're receiving all that money in one lump sum with their tax refund. What we did was, using survey data that's collected here at OSU, we explored how debt levels changed over the year for families who are and are not eligible for the EITC. So this dotted line shows debt levels for EITC ineligible families. What you can see is that over the course of the year, there's not a lot of fluctuation in overall debt levels over the course of the year. For the EITC eligible families, however, which are, you can see their kind of the trend in their debt levels tracked by these dots here. You can see that they're exhibiting the lowest debt levels in February when they receive that tax refund. And then their debt levels slowly increase over the course of the year. So what we estimate is that relative to ineligible families, eligible families are reporting credit card debt balances that are 60% lower in tax time relative to later in the year. So this gives us some inclination that the money is being used to essentially ease finances in the household, which can then lead to improved family process. Indeed, other studies have also demonstrated this, that $1,000 of EITC income has been linked to reduced rates of maternal depression, improvements in parenting outcomes like the home index, and also reduced rates of maternal smoking. And then finally, there's evidence of the labor supply channel, but in a different way than the previous tax credits we've talked about. So as I just talked about at length, the EITC is unique in that it's got this labor subsidy. The purpose of the EITC, the purpose of the structure, is to encourage labor force participation. And there's a large literature demonstrating that the EITC has successfully induced mothers, especially single mothers, to join the labor force, increase their labor supply. We found the opposite effect for married mothers. In fact, married mothers reduce their labor supply when the EITC becomes more generous. But importantly, we've got improved job quality. We find mothers finding jobs and staying in jobs that are of higher quality and have a better earnings trajectory over time as a result of the EITC income, because of the fact that it's that kind of additional tax credit is allowing them to have the financial stability to stay in a high quality job. So, unlike the universal tax credit that I was talking about earlier, where we found reduced maternal labor supply as a result of the credit, here we're kind of seeing the opposite response in terms of maternal labor supply, at least for single moms. Despite the fact that we've seen these very different responses in terms of mom's decision to work, we're finding similar responses in terms of the child development. Okay, so for the last couple of minutes here, I just want to kind of sum up all the research that I just went through. I know that was a lot, so let me give you a few takeaways, and then I'll conclude with some of the policy recommendations. So first takeaway, child tax credits work to improve child development outcomes. So across a range of contexts, different countries, different types of credits, there's strong evidence that transferring income to families with kids improves child development outcomes. And the evidence shows that the effects are strongest for kids from the lowest earning households. So this is a really important tool when we're thinking about closing the wage test score gap or the earnings test score gap, et cetera, these tax credits can be a really important tool for helping kids from poor families to catch up. Another kind of important takeaway from all that literature is that the particular structure of the tax credit does not seem to matter for development. So whether we're talking about a means tested credit like that Canadian child benefit and the new child tax credit here in the US, or we're talking about the EITC, which is a work-based, sorry, I think I cut out there for a second, a work-based credit, we're finding very similar outcomes in terms of child development. The place where we do find differences in terms of the structure of the tax credit is the intermediary outcomes, especially maternal labor supply. So it's kind of a bit of a mystery in this research still that, despite the structure of the credit, we find strong development, positive effects on child development, even though we're finding these very different responses for the intermediary outcome of maternal labor supply, which we know is an important input to child development. A couple other considerations when you're thinking about the structure of the tax of a tax credit and factors that can matter. One that I alluded to a little bit is the timing of the payments. So when a government is implementing a child tax credit, they can choose between a means tested, universal or work-based credit structure, but they also can choose, make decisions about the timing. So are we going to pay out the credit income once a year at tax time, like we do with the EITC? Or are we going to pay it out periodically throughout the year, like we do in the case of the Canadian child benefit and now the new child tax credit here in the US? So one kind of, difficulty in making this decision from a policy standpoint is that, at least in the US context, families say they prefer lump sum payment because they like the forced savings mechanism. They like getting that lump sum money, which they can spend on a used car or something like that. There's evidence that families do spend the money on used cars. We also know that families are using the money for day-to-day needs, which would imply that it would be useful to have at least some of the money distributed throughout the year in a more periodic schedule. And so that's exactly what the child tax credit this year is looking like. A portion of the money is being given to families periodically throughout the year, and then they'll also get the remainder as a lump sum. Another important consideration is what we call the credit. So there's evidence that when we earmark a tax credit as a child tax credit in particular, it's more likely that it's going to be spent on kids items. So there's kind of an optics component here as well, that providing a child tax credit, if we're not calling it a child tax credit, there's less, families are going to be less likely to spend it on things for children in particular. And then I also wanted to just point out quickly that, while tax credits are an amazing tool for helping certain families, it's also true that tax credits are only going to benefit families who are in the tax code, right? So families who don't file their taxes, families who are precariously housed, et cetera, cannot benefit. There's evidence that only 4 out of 5 eligible families actually claim their EITC every year. And the families that don't claim it are really the poorest families, those families who may not be filing a tax return because they don't make enough to owe taxes. So we've got to be cautious of kind of over-relying on these tax credits or not, allowing for programs that can also help families through other mechanisms. So in my last minute here, I'll just leave you with a couple policy recommendations. So, tax credits are implemented at both the federal and the state level. At the federal level, I think the American Rescue Plan really got the changes to the child tax credit right. So they expanded the child tax credit, making it more generous. They changed the credit so it's fully refundable, so it can benefit the lowest income families. And then they also made the default delivery mechanism as a periodic payment. So families would receive the money throughout the year with the option for families to opt into a full lump sum delivery. So I think this is a really great structure for this change to the child tax credit. The only thing left to do here is to make this change permanent, and that's up for debate right now. In Ohio, I think that we can make some additional changes as well. So states also have earned income tax credits that essentially piggyback on the federal credits. So most states' EICs essentially just kind of top up the federal credits. So, for example, in Ohio, families receive 30% of whatever their federal EITC is as a state EITC. So Governor DeWine actually increased the rate, which was great in 2019, from 10% to 30%. But Ohio remains one of only 5 states that has a non-refundable EITC. And as we know, non-refundable credits don't benefit the lowest earning families. So my policy recommendation for Ohio would be to make our state EITC refundable, so that the families we know who benefit the most from these credits and the kids we know who benefit the most from these credits can actually take full advantage. So I will leave it there. Thank you to everyone for listening, and I'm happy to open the floor to some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for a great talk. We have a lot of great questions coming in on the question and answer session. I'm going to start with a question from Scott Graves, who asks, are there any studies available that disaggregate these results by the race or gender of children, specifically for academic outcomes?
Yeah, definitely. So especially there's a lot of studies that look differentially by gender. And I think I kind of mentioned a couple there. I think in general, we find that the tax credit income improves test scores more for boys, but improves a kind of like behavioral index scores better for girls. So for example, the physical aggression indices and things, we find larger decreases in those for girls. Whereas the test scores seem to improve more for boys. I think that's a really important area for future research, trying to understand why would it be that there would be differential impacts by gender, especially because, I think gender is a really kind of interesting one because, of course, gender varies within households. So families that are getting the same credit are kind of maybe using the money differently for boys or girls. When we think about race, the question gets a little more difficult because, race is much less likely to vary within households. So we've got a situation where families of different races are receiving different credits. So it's more difficult to kind of identify the effects. But there was a paper by Raj Chetty and co-authors, which I cited, our IRS paper looking at the EITC, and they show some results by race as well. Looking at they look at a large urban school district, and they find stronger effects for Black kids.
Great, thank you. Jamie O'Leary asks, what do you think are the most effective ways to convince policymakers to offer unconditional cash transfer type of programs to families instead of those dependent on employment, et cetera?
Well, I think, I think that's a great question. So firstly, I think my perspective is that the unconditional cash transfers are not the best tool to pursue. I think those means tested transfers, like the new child tax credit, is the best one. So these are the ones that are most generous for the poorest families, and then phase out with income, rather than the ones that are kind of constant for families for all income levels. The reason being that on paper, they look much cheaper, right? So if you're giving every single family $1,000 versus you're phasing the credit out for families who make over the $200,000 a year, for example, the cost of the program is a lot less. And we know that the effects of these programs are really concentrated among the poorest kids. So I think, my money's on trying to sell those types of credits. I think we're really at an important juncture right now, that it seems to me like this child tax credit, the change to the child tax credit is going to stick. I'm very optimistic that it's going to stick. I think that it's become really apparent that, kids are kind of subjected to these policies without any fault of their own, right? I mean, I think that's the big argument against tax credits here in the United States, that we often hear this argument that, well, people are making decisions about how much to work, et cetera. So why should we be, funding people who are not working a lot by providing them child tax credit? When you're thinking about a kid, it's a lot harder to make that argument. And so, just purely from a how do we sell this to policymakers, I really think this new child tax credit is the exact right way to be doing this. That, even if you want to make that argument about adults, which I personally would not make, but if you want to make that argument adults, okay, you really cannot make that argument about a child. And so I think the means tested child tax credits are really our best hope at kind of enshrining a tax credit, a really generous and effective tax credit program into law.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Let's see. We'll answer a question from Stuart Nealis. First, he asks, is there any way to have a bibliography list of references that support the findings sent out to recipients? Is that something you could share with us for Kathy to send out?
Yep, definitely.
Thank you. And he also has a question about response bias. So do you think there's any response bias to surveys regarding how money is spent from these tax credits, particularly if respondents speculate there's negative association to spending on particular categories?
Yes, absolutely. There's always going to be response bias in any of the surveys. The surveys that I used and that I talked about in this presentation were all nationally representative surveys that there's a lot of kind of money and effort spent on trying to minimize the response bias. But I think, yes, there's absolutely going to be response bias. One thing I will say is that that natural experiment research method that I talked a little bit about in the middle of the talk there, where what we're doing is we're tracking spending among families who were able to enjoy a policy-induced increase to their benefits against spending among kids who did not enjoy the same policy-induced increase in their benefits. So, I think, yes, there's absolutely response bias, but as long as the response bias is not correlated with those policy changes, that shouldn't be what's driving the results of studies that I'm talking about. And so that's another nice thing about the natural experiment approach, that I'm not just kind of comparing the spending of different families. I'm kind of using this policy experiment and tracking changes over time, and then kind of netting out the trends for the so-called control families.
Great, thank you. I have a question from Jing Sun. She asks, is cash or things like books more effective for child development?
Oh, that's a great question. So, the kind of theoretical, I think, cash or things question is a big question in economics. So the or things part of it, we usually call that an in-kind transfer. And so, we would consider not just giving a family books, but also giving them, for example, childcare or a voucher for housing, et cetera. We would consider that giving a family things, and we would call that an in-kind transfer. And then we often kind of contrast that against cash. So theoretically speaking, it's always going to be better to give the family cash, because the family knows best what their particular needs are, right? So if I'm a family and you give me an in-kind transfer of a childcare voucher, for example, well, maybe my mom lives next door and she takes care of my kid, and I can't use that benefit at all, right? But if you give me cash, I know best what I need, and I'm able to kind of use that cash to buy nutritious food, let's say that's the thing I need in my household. So theoretically speaking, it's always going to be better to give the family cash, because they can use the money in a way that's most effective for them. I think there are a lot of kind of other, once we get out of theory and get into the real world, there are a lot of other considerations that come up when we're making these decisions, especially when we're thinking about giving childcare and that kind of thing, right? Because of the fact that we know that an individual family's consumption of childcare is not, their decision to consume childcare is not happening in a bubble, right? Their decision of whether to use their local childcare provider is affecting all the families around them. It's going to affect the decision of the childcare provider of whether to operate in that community, et cetera. So there could be other structural reasons why it might be more effective to give an in-kind transfer of childcare, for example. But, kind of the bird's eye theory of it is it's always better to give a family cash and trust them to spend the money in the way that's going to produce the most effective results for their kids and their particular circumstances. And I'll say one quick thing too. You know, the study that I mentioned earlier, where we were looking at how do families actually spend the money that you transfer to them. You know, one big motivation for that study was that there's a lot of kind of, conservative policymakers who argue that giving money, cash transfers to families is not wise because families don't spend the money on good things. They waste the money on, beer and popcorn, for example. That was like a very famous line in Canada that a conservative politician was trying to make the argument that we should not be giving families the cash because they're wasting the money. I think that's just a very kind of paternalistic view of families, the idea that, they can't be trusted to use the money in the most effective way. And I think our study really demonstrated that that's not the case, that the families were using the money for, good things, childcare, et cetera, things that we think are important. And in fact, we saw reductions in consumption of alcohol and cigarettes and other, goods that families may use to cope with stress.
Great, that's a great point. Thank you for adding that. I have a question from Joan Sporl, who asks whether you can say anything about how taxes could impact stress levels, adverse childhood experiences, and what the associated costs of this are.
Yeah, totally. So, I think that family process channel that I was trying to get at, and I know I went quickly so that, I'm sure it was too much material, which I always do. But anyway, the family process channel, I think, really is kind of getting at this question. So we have good evidence that when you give families tax credit income, there's reduced rates of maternal depression, which I think if we're thinking about the ACEs, that's going to be like a very important determinant of that. We also see, the kind of lower levels of lower debt levels, et cetera, when families are getting the money. There's other research, some great qualitative research, which I didn't cite here, but by Catherine Eden and co-authors, where they surveyed families in Boston area about how they use their EITC income. And it really showed families were using that money to kind of catch up on past due bills and things that could be incredibly stressful for the family. Paying your late heating bill in the middle of winter in Boston. I can imagine that being an incredible stressor on the family. So, I think there are a lot of reasons to think that the tax credits do reduce these kind of intermediary family process type conditions, or improve the family process type conditions. In terms of the cost of the program, these programs are very costly. It costs a lot of money to give families money. The child tax credit expansion, for example, is going to cost a lot of money. But when we're thinking about kind of the cost effectiveness of that spending, there's some great work by Nathaniel Hendren and co-authors that essentially shows that when you transfer income to families with small children, because of the fact that that income allows the kids to flourish, which then later down the line allows them to join the labor force, the investments in childhood really pay for themselves by and large. Because what it means is when the child grows up, they're going to be part of the labor force, they're going to be paying taxes themselves, they're going to be less likely to be using other benefit programs like Medicaid, et cetera, which are even more costly. So Medicaid is incredibly costly. So, if we can kind of, if we're just talking dollars and cents here, the payoff for investing in children is like, 3 times what you put in, you're going to get out, I think, is around the estimate that Hendren and his colleagues come up with in that great paper.
Great, thank you. And I think this actually relates to a question that just came in from Natalie Zaborski. She asks, is there a way to prove the financial impact of some of these credits? For example, for every $1 spent, we see she says $2, I think you're saying $3 positive financial impact on the community. Any positive change is encouraging, but inevitably these programs will face policymakers asking for the business case around implementing the program. So how do you appeal to the commercial perspective with that 0.06 standard deviation improvement?
Yeah, so I think this work by Nathaniel Hendren, and I can add that onto the reference list that I send out. This is exactly the question that paper is trying to answer. It's a very technical paper, but you can kind of like, I mean, I know I do this, just skip to the conclusion sometimes. But yeah, they're essentially trying to kind of make, take those intermediary estimates, the ones that I'm showing you, like that 0.06% or 0.06 standard deviation improvement, and then relate that to the labor force impact later on of those kids. So for example, if I improve my test scores by 10%, how is that going to kind of improve my labor force outcomes when I eventually grow up and join the labor force myself? How is that going to reduce my use of other expensive programs? So that's essentially what they're trying to do in that paper, and I can give the reference.
That would be great. Thank you. And we also have a specific request from Margaret Jenkins to share the name and author of that Boston study that you just talked about. So if you could add that one to your.
Yeah, for sure.
Well.
The author is Catherine Eden, and it's a great book. It's called Making Ends Meet. And I'll put it on the reference list as well.
Perfect. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Kelsey Ellingson. She says, based on the graph showing that debt will reaccumulate throughout the year after a family receives the EITC, is it accurate to assume that the promise of the EITC doesn't lie in improving families' financial position, although there may be other positives?
Yes, that's a great question. So I didn't have time to get into that in the talk. So, you know, the fact that the debt levels were the lowest in February, there's kind of the corollary of that, which is that it means their debt levels are really high in kind of December, January. So I think that's a great point. And you know, what I'll say is that we have a second study, which I didn't talk about, where we, instead of looking at the kind of inter-year variation in debt levels, what we do is that same natural experiment approach where we look over years, families that enjoyed policy-induced increase to their EITC, what happens to their kind of overall debt and savings levels. What we found is that savings increase. So there does seem to be an improvement like over time in families' financial situation. But we also found indication that there might be increases in credit card debt, which would really kind of reflect that same trend that I was showing you in the figure, where we see the kind of increasing debt levels over the course of the year. That's one of the reasons why I think this change to the child tax credit is so great, that the money is going to be paid out in part periodically. Because what that says to me is that you know, families have budgetary necessities throughout the year that they are not able to pay for, and they're essentially using credit card and other expensive debt to finance that kind of budgetary shortfall throughout the year. Meanwhile, their EITC that they've earned throughout the year is kind of sitting in a pot at the government, right? And they could be using that money instead of taking on the debt. So for me, this, you know, the option to get the money periodically, I think is really important because of this fact, that because it does look like families could use it throughout the year.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we have time for, but thank you, Dr. Jones, for an interesting and really relevant talk today. And thank you all for joining us. We hope you will join us again for these forums throughout the year. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate all the questions, and I appreciate everyone listening. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any other questions.
Absolutely. Thank you.